Hello, this is Kyrasis, and in this Blood Death Net analysis video, we'll be talking about the initial preview of the Deathbringer hero Talons. Deathbringer's core mechanic is Reaper's Mark, a new ability that has three main aspects. First is the ability cast itself, which does an unknown amount of initial damage at the cost of 2 runes on a 1-minute cooldown. Second, the attack applies a debuff to the main target enemy that allows your frost and shadow damage instances to build up stacks of the Reaper's Mark debuff. Third, the marks will explode for single target damage proportional to the number of stacks you have generated on the target. As for this last paragraph of the tooltip, this all has to do with making sure Reaper's Mark gets full value or near full value when you're using it on a target that is about to die. So it will first attempt to bounce the Reaper's Mark stacks to a new target if your current target dies, or if there are no other targets around that you're engaged with, it will prematurely trigger an explosion of your Reaper's Mark stacks on the target if it is alone and below 35% health. But for all intents and purposes, we can ignore these effects 99% of the time. For the high-level overview, it is also important to talk about Exterminate, which is the capstone hero talent of this tree. Exterminate causes the Reaper's Mark explosion to give us a proc that greatly enhances our next Morrowind, making it cost no runes and makes it deal significantly more damage both against a single target and in AoE against multiple targets. This Morrowind then gives us a 15% chance to instantly start this cycle again with a fresh Reaper's Mark application on the primary target that your Morrowind has hit. Otherwise, we will need to wait on the cooldown of the Reaper's Mark cast to re-enter this gameplay cycle. Regardless of anything else these hero talents provide, this is the core mechanic and gameplay loop that is being added to Blood Death Knights using Deathbringer talents. Most of the other hero talents enhance parts of this gameplay loop in various ways, so those are going to be the next talents that we will cover. Afterwards, we will talk more about the choice nodes, which, for the most part, deal with separate types of benefits or utility. The next talent we are going to talk about enhances the initial Reaper's Mark cast all of the time. And this talent is Wave of Souls, which gives the Reaper's Mark cast an AoE damage component, as well as a Shadowfrost damage vulnerability debuff to all targets hit. Since I haven't spoken to it specifically yet, most of these talents in the Deathbringer talent preview are missing their damage numbers, so we don't really have a good idea at all at how much damage any of these new effects will do relative to existing abilities, and that will limit the extent to which we can evaluate the implications of these talents. But moving on, I'm going to be skipping over the debuff window for a second to talk about the explosion mechanic, since the debuff window will require a lengthier conversation. With the addition of the talents Shuddering Soul and Grim Reaper, the Reaper's Mark explosions now do damage when enemy health is low, potentially generating a Reaper's Mark execute effect as well on the target if they are below 35% health, while also doing 10% of the explosion damage in an AoE around the explosion target. There is a physical damage reduction component to Shuddering Souls as well, but the uptime on that effect is going to be low enough, regardless of talent loadout, that you don't really need to worry about it too much. And before we get into the choice nodes, that leaves us with talking about the debuff window, which we will now talk about in more detail. The main takeaway from the debuff window is that, for all intents and purposes, any ability that generates stacks is gaining bonus single target damage per stack when used in this window. By default, Shadow or Frost damage instances add 1 stack, and thanks to the hero talent Bind in Darkness, Shadowfrost damage instances generate 2 stacks each, with the potential to crit for double that stack generation. So if we end up in a situation where we can't easily hit the 40 stack cap every single debuff window, then stack generation potential has the chance to change our ability priorities. But to help us with that, several Deathbringer hero talents provide additional sources of Shadowfrost damage. Bind in Darkness, which we were already showing, makes Blood Boil do Shadowfrost damage. Blood Fever gives our Blood Plague Ticks an unknown chance to proc additional Shadowfrost damage as well. And while we will talk more about this choice node later, just know that we have the option of either converting our runic power spenders into Shadowfrost damage, or making our Blood Plague ticks tick twice as fast. With that in mind, let us take a look at the potential stack generation per cast of our abilities. For the sake of this slide, I am not considering passive abilities here, which is how I am also treating Blood Plague, and outside of Tombstone casts, Shattering Bone will not be considered. There's also a possibility that the Razor Ice Runeforge could increase stack generation pretty dramatically, but I'm also going to be ignoring that as well for the time being until we have a chance to test that on alpha. In any case, we are just interested in active casts because we want to look at how this might impact our ability priorities while a Reaper's Mark debuff is active on an enemy. As such, the passive sources of damage don't factor into this decision making. I'm also assuming Dancing Rune Weapon does not interact with this stack mechanic at all, because this does not look like the type of mechanic that Dancing Rune Weapon would generally interact with. So, with all of those disclaimers out of the way, let us look at the stack generation per cast of these abilities. Death and Decay, Abomination Limb, and Bone Storm have much higher stack generation potential per cast than anything else on this list. Bone Storm in particular has extremely high stack generation potential with Dark Talons selected. The main implication here is that we might be interested in syncing these abilities up with the Reaper's Mark debuff in particular, to the point where we'd be willing to sit on these cooldowns to make that happen. As for the high stack generators that are also talents, this high stack generation potential likely makes these talents more valuable for Deathbringer than what they would otherwise be. Though the same could be said of Empower Rune Weapon, given that it provides 15% haste, and that is not shown in this listing, because it isn't off of the global cooldown. So the Death Knight talent tree capstones would need to be investigated in more detail before anything definitive could be said about that. Of course, we would also need alpha to release and to know where the damage numbers of everything involved in the Reaper's Mark loop landed first. Moving on, normally we have a slight preference towards using runes on Hardstrike over using Blood Boil charges. However, with this stack generation difference, it is possible that we would put more priority on Blood Boil over Hardstrike during the Reaper's Mark debuff window in particular. It's the same deal with Death's Caress and Mara Rend as well. So these are things that we'll be investigating in more detail as we enter into alpha and get more information. Now, in order to go any further into this discussion, we first need to talk about a choice node that impacts how Reaper's Mark fundamentally works. The first of 4 choice nodes that we are going to talk about in detail is Swift End versus Painful Death. We have not talked about either of these talents up to this point. Swift End makes Reaper's Mark half the cooldown for half the cost, which doubles the amount of time we will be able to enter the Reaper's Mark gameplay loop and to gain associated benefits. Granted, the 30-second cooldown means that we are much less likely to have long cooldown abilities that are good at generating stacks available for every debuff window, such as Abomination Limb or even Bone Storm. So, at least when using Swift End, how effective different abilities are at generating Reaper's Mark stacks is more likely to be significant than baseline, which might not be the case for Painful Death. Painful Death does 2 things. 1, it makes Reaper's Mark now explode at 50 stacks, and 2, it increases the chance of our Mara Rend procs triggering a new Reaper's Mark from 15% to 30%. The second effect is pretty straightforward, and it allows us to effectively get 20% more Reaper's Mark debuffs out of every Reaper's Mark cast, relative to the original 15% proc rate. The first effect is potentially more interesting. Now, this isn't a guarantee, but one possible interpretation of Painful Death's first effect is that the explosions will only happen once you reach 50 stacks, and that there is no longer a limiting duration on the Reaper's Mark debuff. This interpretation is a lot more interesting, a lot more competitive with the powerful Swift Death option, and the name Painful Death makes a lot more sense if it is shorthand for a slow and painful death, since this modification would guarantee you the ability to build 50 stacks even if it takes a lot longer to get to that big explosion. Taken together, the winner of this choice node would be decided by how many stacks you could effectively generate and the gameplay differences between players taking Swift End and players taking Painful Death. Unfortunately, without being able to test mechanics and without actual damage numbers, we can't speculate much beyond this point. But looping back to potential stack generation on every ability per cast, 40 stacks would likely not be reliable with a swift end build, making you care about stack generation per cast at least to some extent. Painful Death, meanwhile, does not particularly care about stack generation as long as it is able to resolve all of its subsequent Reaper's Mark debuffs before Reaper's Mark comes off of cooldown again. So stack generation may or may not be something that affects our rotation at the end of the day. At this point, we have gone over everything that feeds into the Reaper's Mark gameplay loop, so now we will be talking about the remaining choice nodes in detail. I've already talked about some stack implications associated with Dark Talons versus Wither Away earlier, but now let us talk about the actual trade-off in detail. By making runic power spenders deal Shadowfrost damage, Dark Talons increases the damage of Deathstrike by 43%, in addition to increasing its stack generation potential. Granted, this does mean that Bloodshot no longer affects Deathstrike when Dark Talons is taken, so you only get around a 14% increase over Bloodshot's existing increase when both talents are being used at the same time. Additionally, our Icy Talons can stack to 5 instead of the original cap of 3, which doesn't add nearly as much single target damage as Deathstrike doing Shadowfrost damage, but it is more than 0. The way in which Icy Talon's maximum stacks is increased to 5 is overly convoluted, but it shouldn't take an excessive amount of time to get your maximum stacks to 5, and it will increase the maximum attack speed bonus from Icy Talons from 18% to 30% for our auto attacks. Meanwhile, Wither Away doubles the amount of damage Blood Plague does in a way that also doubles the amount of stack generation Blood Plague generates. It also gives our big Exterminate Mara Wrens the ability to apply Blood Plague, but we will be using Blood Boil often enough in our rotation anyway that this shouldn't particularly matter what talents we are using. In any case, one of these talents scales with multiple targets while the other does not. So with some tuning, Dark Talons could be the pure single target damage option, while Wither Away is always better against multiple targets. However, Wither Away could very easily be the best choice in all situations if the tuning is not done carefully. Moving on, we have our first case of a trade-off that is very one-sided. Death's Messenger reduces the cooldowns of Lichborn and Raised Dead by 25%. Raised Dead normally provides a small amount of single target damage, while Lichborn is a minor defensive cooldown. A 25% cooldown reduction effect on both of these abilities increases their effectiveness by 33%, which doesn't amount to too large of a gain at the end of the day. Even so, it is better than nothing, which is exactly what Death's Messenger is competing with. Expelling Shield is a 10% cast speed reduction that requires a lot of circumstances to be true to get any useful benefit out of it at all. And even if the stars align, a 10% reduction on 6 seconds is basically nothing. There's not much else to say about Expelling Shield other than that it is a very, very low value talent and could potentially use some major adjustments. Next, we have a mitigation versus EHP trade-off with Death's Bargain versus Rune Carved Plates. Death's Bargain provides an auto-triggering Death Pact effect at 50% strength. That happens every 2 minutes. For Blood, this effect basically procs on cooldown. We also have a cooldown reduction effect of 5 seconds for every Reaper's Mark explosion on both the Death's Bargain effect and Death Pact, which, if we are being very generous and assuming Swift End, effectively reduces the cooldown of both to 100 seconds instead of the original 120. So altogether, you can imagine Death's Bargain as giving you 80% the value of Death Pact itself, assuming you have Death Pact already talented, and 60% otherwise, which is going to normally be the case, and that's just very underwhelming overall. From a Blood perspective, the net healing of Death Pact is extremely small, and the talent is not competitive at all in the current talent tree. So given that Death's Bargain is worth even less than Death Pact itself, it is safe to say that Death's Bargain would never be taken, especially given the strength of the competing talent Rune Carved Plates. Rune Carved Plates provides what looks to be a sustainable 10% damage reduction effect. There is some concern that the 5-second buff duration may require us to purposefully stagger our rune use to some extent to keep it active all of the time, but it is hard to say how much of an issue this will be right now. In short, if we don't spend a rune for 4 global cooldowns straight, we will lose our buff stack. But the rotational concerns aside, Rune Carved Plates would be taken all of the time in this current matchup, and you would need to do a lot to Death's Bargain to make it a competitive benefit with Rune Carved Plates, especially for Blood. Now, if you've been paying attention, you will notice that there are not a lot of defensive benefits associated with Deathbringer hero talents. The Reaper's Mark cycle is mostly net neutral with regards to runes and runic power. It will cost you some extra runes up front with the Reaper's Mark cast itself, but you are getting those runes back with the free Mara runs at the end of the cycle. Reaper's Mark does provide 5% physical damage reduction in an AoE through Shuddering Soul, but the uptime on that debuff is 30% to 40% with Swift End at best. So we are talking about an average of 1 to 2% physical damage reduction, which again is not much. Death's Messenger in combination with Unholy Endurance provides some defensive cooldown benefits with higher Lichborn uptime, but that ends up being a fraction of a percent of average damage reduction value. As such, Rune Carved Plates is almost all of the defensive benefit that is being provided by Deathbringer talents. Almost everything else is just increasing your damage output in one way or another. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it is something to keep in mind. So let us quickly review all of the benefits of Deathbringer as a whole, with me making some assumptions on which choice nodes are being taken in the tree. A significant portion of mostly single target damage benefits is associated with the Reaper's Mark gameplay loop, though 10% of explosion damage and the second Exterminate scythe deal what looks to be uncapped AoE damage. Reaper's Mark explosions deal more damage to low health targets, in addition to providing free Soul Reaper casts, making our single target damage profile more execute oriented than normal. Our Blood Plague damage is more than doubled between the dot ticking twice as fast and an unknown amount of bonus damage procs on Blood Plague ticks through Blood Fever. We have some amount of uptime on a Shadowfrost damage amp debuff on all targets, depending on our talent selection and critical strike rate. While most new damage sources have Shadowfrost damage, some existing abilities have had their damage converted to Shadowfrost, such as Blood Boil and, if the talent is taken, Death Strike. With a clean rotation, it looks like we will be able to indefinitely maintain a 10% damage reduction buff through Rune Carved Plates, which is supplemented by a low uptime physical damage reduction effect through Shuddering Soul. Finally, we have some cooldown reduction on Lichborn and Raised Dead that provide minor benefits. There are a few other things to note here. First, due to the stack mechanics associated with the Reaper's Mark debuff, there's a chance that there are some new rotational implications during the debuff windows to try and increase stack generation. There is also a chance of Rune Carved Plates causing weird rotational implications in order to maintain the damage reduction debuff, though we don't have enough information to make a final call on either of these two things before alpha. Next, a higher proportion of our damage will likely be magic damage with Deathbringer. Most new sources of damage are magic damage, in addition to the option being given to us to make our Death Strike Shadowfrost damage instead of physical. This also means that Deathbringer has some amount of anti-synergy with Bloodshot, though realistically I think we will still be taking it all of the time in raid. The only other seemingly significant effect on talents is that Bone Storm would be valued more because it has particularly high Reaper's Mark stack generation potential per cast. Weirdly enough, most of the added value of Bone Storm would be in the form of potential single target damage, though we don't have enough information to even guess if people would entertain using Bone Storm right now due to all of the missing values. Both of these talent impacts are amplified if Dark Talons is taken in the Deathbringer hero talent tree. Overall, secondary stat effects are a bit ambiguous. If stack generation rates end up being relevant, then Critical Strike will see some increase in value over what it has now. However, if stack generation rates are not relevant, either because we can easily hit stack caps or because Painful Death functions in a way that guarantees max stacks are hit, then Critical Strike doesn't gain value through this mechanic. Haste probably has some amount of anti-synergy with these hero talents regardless of how final mechanics work out. Since Blood Plague doesn't scale with haste, and with its now double damage, almost all new damage sources do not scale with haste, except for that haste might allow you to generate stacks faster during the Reaper's Mark debuff to some extent. Though if we are in a situation where we can reliably reach max stacks on each debuff window, then haste is no longer providing value even through that mechanism. So these are some things that we'll be keeping an eye on throughout alpha development. So at its core, Deathbringer places a high emphasis on this new Reaper's Mark gameplay loop, Blood Plague damage, damage reduction effects, and magic damage in general, along with some extremely minor utility perks. Deathbringer affects blood very differently than the previous Sandlane hero talent tree. Sandlane focused almost entirely on expanding and empowering the Heartstrike and Deathstrike gameplay loop, while Deathbringer leaves the Heartstrike and Deathstrike loop almost entirely alone, with no significant changes in rune or runic power generation, and only an optional damage increase available on Deathstrike. So, the Reaper's Mark gameplay loop and Blood Plague are primarily driving increased damage for Deathbringer instead of Heartstrike and Deathstrike, which is the case for Sandlane. Defensively, the two hero talent trees also approach things differently, with Deathbringer relying more heavily on damage reduction effects, while Sandlane improves effective Deathstrike healing. Conceptually, I think it is interesting that both hero talent trees are reasonably different from each other in most regards. It is also nice to see that Deathbringer does not appear to have any potential problematic gameplay incentives, such as what we saw with Sandlane, both with having to spam Vampiric Blood and putting a higher emphasis on standing in Death and Decay. The only potential trouble spot for Deathbringer is rune carved plates maybe requiring some weird rotational modifications to maintain, which is something that we will want to keep an eye on moving forward. But overall, I'm pretty happy with the Deathbringer talents at the moment. But once we actually move into alpha, I would start being a lot more opinionated on the actual numbers involved instead of just judging things based on their concepts. In any case, let me know what your thoughts are about Deathbringer in the comments below. And if there's anything in particular you would like to see changed, or anything you think is especially problematic with the hero class. As always, feel free to stop by the channel Discord if you want to talk about Blood Death Knight theory crafting, general Mythic Plus questions, or if you would like a Mythic Plus log review. The channel Discord information, as well as my personal Discord information, is in the video description below. And if you want to make it easier for other people to find this content, feel free to upvote the video and subscribe to the channel. In the meantime, good luck and have fun.